How we doing, everybody? Hey, we are in Exodus. We are on the cusp of the Promised Land. That's where we are in Numbers chapter 13 this morning. So, if you want to turn in your scriptures to Numbers chapter 13, I do want to say I have the opportunity for the last few years. I've been able to coach and invest in pastors all over the United States, teaching them. Basically, I just teach them all things that we've done wrong, not to do those things so that they can do better than what we have. But one of the things as I'm talking to pastors, their top 5 issues, in their top 5, one of the things is I feel as a pastor, I'm always caring and supporting for other people, but nobody ever cares and supports for me. What do I do about it? And I said, you should come work it together, church, because we have the opposite problem where you care. And I just wanted to say before we started this morning, I thank you so much for every call, every text, every post, everything as you've helped support our family. If you don't know, my dad's faith became sight this week as he won his battle with cancer because he entered heaven to see Jesus cancer-free. And somebody said, well, I know he's just walking around heaven. I said, no, he's not. He is on his knees in front of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the very person that he has preached about and lived his life for. He is worshiping. And what a seat he has this morning to one of the greatest worship experiences that he will ever have on this side of heaven. We'll never get that. But while we're hurting and we're sad here, hope deferred makes the heart sick, is what the Bible says. But the good news is that at the same time that we're processing loss, we're a little jealous. We're a little jealous that he's where he belongs, and one day we will be where we belong. And so I just wanted to say thank you, church, for working. These last few weeks have been literally like hell on earth, having to process and doing all this. But your support has helped this be incredible. So I can say, and I feel a little guilty when I'm talking to these pastors, but I feel very loved and cared for, and our family feels the same way. There's no other place we'd rather be than right here with our church family, walking beside you and journeying. So thank you all so much for living out the gospel. And so now let's talk about the gospel. Numbers chapter 13, like I said, we're right here on the cusp of the Promised Land. What we're going to see this morning, we're getting a front row seat to Moses sending out the spies to the Promised Land. Remember, this was the land that God told them. This is a promise to Abraham. It was a promise to Jacob that God's going to give them a land. We now know that land today as Israel, right? A very contested piece of property that everybody seems to want. But we're going to get this front row seat. So if you look in Numbers 13, starting in verse 17, he says this. When Moses sent them to scout out the land in Canaan, he told them, go up to the way of Negev and then go up to the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there, see if they're strong or they're weak, few or many. Is the land that they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in their encampments or their fortifications? Is the land fertile? Is the land unproductive? By the way, Israel has one of the most fertile soils in all of the world today. Like you're growing vegetables and fruits in a desert, okay? Tasty, minus the figs. Those are all gross. It doesn't matter where you are. And the dates. He says, are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. That's important. Joshua's going to repeat this phrase multiple times in Joshua chapter 1. But he says you need to be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It is the season for the first ripe grapes. So we want to see, when you bring back the report, bring back some fruit. We want to taste and see what's happening. So what I want to show you this morning is regardless of the circumstances, we all come around the gospel of Jesus that he wants us to follow him by faith, that we walk in faith. We do not walk by sight, but we walk in faith. I want you this morning to be able to put your faith in the promises of God regardless of circumstances that you might be running in, okay? That's where we're going to get by the time we're finished. But I've got to break this passage up into 3 different sections this morning to make it a little easier. So let's talk about the report. There was a report. You send the spies out. What were they told to do? You bring us back a report. We need to know before we try to move over 1 million people into this promised land. I mean, they're right there on it. They're close enough that Moses is going to end up going on the mountain. Moses can't go in the promised land. Remember that? He got in trouble. But God lets him see it from the mountain. And so this is how close we are. This is the thing that for generations and generations, they've heard the promise. God's going to get us there. They heard it from Abraham. They've heard it from Jacob. God's going to get us to the promised land. And finally, this group of people, these Israelites, are going to be able to physically step into the promise. But watch what happens. When they send out a reconnaissance mission, I need to know, what is the land like? What do we need to be prepared for? This mission was to gather intel that they saw in the land. What is it productive? Are there trees? What does the fruit taste like? They're gathering information, but when they return, when the 12 spies return, watch this, verse 23. When they came to the Escol Valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by the two men. Now, I've seen paintings of this, and people, the paintings that I've always seen, like in children's churches, these two guys carrying this big pole, and the grape clusters are like massive. No, they were grape clusters like you would get at the store. They just tasted really, really good, and they were full. So I don't know what your visual is there, but I'm having to relearn a lot of things that I thought as a kid. So it was carried on a pole by two men. They also took some pomegranates. They took some figs. And that place was called the Escol Valley because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut there. And at the end of how many days? Y'all remember that? Let's keep that in the back of our minds. Remember, I told you when you see words like that, you should mark them, circle them, highlight them, keep them in your mind because it means something. So they're at the end of the 40 days, they returned from scouting out the land. The men went back to Moses and Aaron, and then the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, and here's some of its fruit." By the way, when we talk about milk and honey, there weren't rivers of 2% milk flowing, okay? No almond milk, no oat milk. And when it talks about honey, what it's talking about is the honey that the date trees produce in the desert. And the milk was not referring to actual milk. It was referring to the mountain goats. So he's basically saying there's a lot of honey and meat in this place. We're going to be good. And so up to this point, the report sounded good, right? We got food. We got great here. You can taste it. So you don't take our word for it. Eat this and see. Everything in the report sounds good. But within one verse, everything changes. And that happens in verse 28. He says this. There's always these people. You can talk about how great something is and what a blessing or something you received or your brand new car or whatever it is. And you always going to have the naysayers go, yeah, but. Y'all know those people? Life's going good. Yeah, but. They have one of these moments. Look in verse 28. He says, well, however, the people living in the land, they're strong. They get good food. We got trees. Got milk and honey. But the people in the land, they're pretty strong. The cities are large. They're fortified. We also saw the descendants of the Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites. Sound like we need to call Terminex. There's a lot of ites. They live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live there by the sea and along the Jordan. So it goes from bad to worse. We got good food, we got good trees, we got good land. But they're going to kill us, and there's no way we can take them out because they're fortified. And so there's this fear. There's this fear that the report was supposed to tell them about the land, about what they were supposed to do. But instead, the report of the land comes back, and they flip it and make everything negative because we don't really want to have to do that, so we're going to be the naysayers. So this guy named Caleb speaks up, and he quiets the naysayers. He's like, I was one of the spies. I need to speak my side of this. I need to be able to share what I saw, my perspective. In verse 30, it says this. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses, and he says, let's go up now. Let's go. And let's take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer the land. Now, how can 12 people go into a land, come back with a report, you got naysayer, and how can Caleb sit here and say, after they said how fortified it was, how big the people was, and Caleb says, we can certainly take this land. Where did that confidence come from? I'll tell you where it came from. Because in Exodus chapter 13, God told them to go take the land because it was theirs. Because he relied in the promise. See, a lot of times we will look at the circumstance and we will miss the promise. We will let circumstances dictate how we run our lives instead of the promises of God that tells us what we need to be doing to start with. He has a much better perspective. So Caleb remembers Exodus. He remembers the words of God. Go conquer the land. So look what he says in verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him, he's outnumbered in this conversation, by the way. But the men who had grown up with him responded, we can't attack the people because they're stronger than we are, Caleb. They're stronger than we are. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land that they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is the one that devours its inhabitants. And all of the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. They came from Nephilim. These were the giants. And you probably got questions about the Nephilim people. I'm trying to say that right because in my head I see it one way. We were ordering food yesterday. My wife wanted a quesadilla. And right before I ordered that for her, she decided to be funny and say quesadilla. So when they asked what my order was, my brain got all messed up, and my dumb self asked for a quesadilla and had to go back. But luckily, where I was, they didn't know the difference. So sometimes it's a blessing, and sometimes it's a curse. But anyhow, so the Nephilim says, to ourselves, listen to this, to ourselves we seem like grasshoppers to them, and we must have seemed the same to them. Isn't it interesting that they would use the term, we look like a grasshopper to those guys? And those guys, when we looked at how big they were, we felt like grasshoppers. Now, why is this an interesting term? Because remember, again, it's something very specific in the Scripture, right? Think about a grasshopper. Back then, a grasshopper is a picture of the smallest insect that you could eat. What did John the Baptist eat? Grasshoppers. Gross. But, hey, to each his own. But I'll knock it till you try it. I'm good. Back then, the grasshoppers are a picture of the smallest edible animal that they could eat. They would dip them in honey and eat them. It was like going to your life group and eating, your salsa and your chips. Dipping the grasshopper in the honey was the version of salsa and chips back in this day. But I want you to understand something. The contrast in this text, that what are they, by using that term, by saying we're grasshopper, here's what they're trying to say. They're trying to put picture to what they saw and to create a fear. This is the early version of the media putting negative things in to create fear of people. Right? Remember orange? We're at a level orange. We're at a level red. When we used to do that thing back in 2001, that was like, oh my gosh, we're at a level. I was in Tigerville, South Carolina, and that thing went red, and I thought they're going to attack Tigerville, South Carolina. Anybody know where Tigerville, South Carolina is? If you went to North Greenville University, you know exactly where it is. Nobody's touching Tigerville, South Carolina, right? So anyway, it was a fear. They drove this fear. I want you to understand something. Caleb's first words were, we must go and take the land. There was confidence in the promise, but the spies said, we can't. Now, isn't it interesting that these two groups, their report was not supposed to be based on an opinion of what they should do. It was meant to inform the people on the land. But how quickly we will throw our opinions into what God has asked us to do. How quickly. It wasn't meant for them to start a committee. It wasn't meant for them to come back and let's vote on this thing. God had given them the land. That's why we call it the promised land. It was a gift. All they had to do was go and take the gift. And they didn't do it. God's like, if you take it, you can receive it. It's yours. It's a promise. But they were disobedient. And disobedience always leads to a revolt. And there was a massive revolt. So this revolt takes place in Numbers chapter 14. The majority of the people, no matter how loud their voice is, isn't always right. Right? No matter, the majority of the people can have the loudest voices, it does not mean that it's always right. I always say this, the loudest voices always come from the cheapest seats. Right? I don't have to yell as loud when I'm courtside. But when I decided to pay $5 for the nosebleed ticket, I got to yell a lot louder But the people that sit courtside were willing to pay the price. So here we have a bunch of nosebleed people that weren't willing to pay the price, and now their negativity is going to lead to a revolt. This is not the time, people, to be having a revolt. We just came out of slavery. We are out here in the desert. We really probably should listen to this guy named Moses because God's given him the directions. And now we're going to try to revolt against him, and we're going to overthrow power out here, and then what? Well, watch what happens. In verse 14, then what is this word? The what? This is not a good day for Moses. Everybody is against him. How many people? About 1 million. You ever had like 1.5 million people mad at you at one time? He says this, the whole community broke into loud cries, and the people wept that night. This dude led us out here to this land that was promised, and he's going to get us killed. Watch what they say. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron, and the whole community told them, listen to this, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or only if we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Our wives and our children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us just to go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, let's just appoint a new leader, and we'll go back to Egypt. Think about Egypt. What was Egypt? Egypt was no freedom at all. Egypt was, we're just going to work at the hands of Pharaoh. We're going to be saturated in the culture of idolatry because it's what we know. And sometimes it's easier for us to go back to what we know than it is to trust God and move towards the future. You don't believe me? Where were the disciples after the resurrection? When Jesus saw them again in Galilee, what were they doing? Fishing. They went back to the only thing they knew. But the problem was they had been empowered to go and preach the gospel. They had the Holy Spirit. And they go back to the thing they know. So often, we get so uncomfortable. We don't like tension. Listen, tension is the place that we grow. You can't have growth in your spiritual life without tension. You've got to wrestle with it. You have to process it. And they have gotten themselves, and listen, they have journeyed and they are on the border of the promised land. And think about everything that God has done up to this point. Everything that God has done. And the words that come out of their mouth instead of God, thank you for bringing us here, it is we would rather go back to eat. Let's find someone who would lead us back to the place where they misused us, they abused us, they starved us. We would rather go there than step in faith to go to the next place. So in Numbers 13, we learn, by the way, it wasn't God who sent them into the promised land to spy. Did y'all know this? This was new for me this week. One thing that I love about the Bible will always explain itself, and it'll point back to each other and give us these clues. So when you read through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we'll see Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy gives this entire commentary of the first 4 books of the Bible. So if you don't have time to read through the first 4 books, just go to Deuteronomy. It summarizes every single thing that happened all the way through it. Also written by, anybody know who Deuteronomy is written by? Moses. Moses writes the first 5 books of the scripture that we call the Torah. And if you'll look in Deuteronomy chapter 1, it shows us that God wasn't the one who sent them into the promised land to go spy it out. God just okayed them to go. So in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 22, it says, and then all of you approached me, Moses, and said, let's send some men ahead of us so that we may explore the land for I want you to catch all these words. Let me start it over. Then all of you approached me and said, let men ahead of, what's that word? Us, so that they may explore the land for, what's that word? And bring back a report about the route that we should go up to the cities and we will come to. And the plan seemed good to me, so I selected 12 men from among you, one for each tribe. What's the problem in that verse? Who's this for? This is for us. Did they need to go see the promised land? No, God had already told them it was theirs. What did they need to see? If I told you I had a brand new house for you on the Cooper River, do you need to go see it before you accept it? No, you're like, give me the keys before you change your mind. I want to sign the papers, right? The same thing. They are about to enter a place that where they had to spend all this time so dependent on Egypt to provide for them that God's given them a land that he's already provided for them. The fruit, the food. See, God takes this desert place they're in to try to build trust with them. This is the quail. This is the manna. This is the water. This is crossing the Red Sea. This is trust. And they've come this far, and there is no trust. So the plan to go in the promised land originated by the people, and God allows it. And what we see here is there is a providence of God and the free will of man. God had already provided. God is sovereign, has already given it to him. But free will plays and says, okay, if you want to go, you can go. Now, what God's going to do is God's going to use this. He's going to use what the decision that these guys just made. He's going to use it to bring them back to a place of absolute dependence on him. I'm going to show you. You can go take a peek and look, but I'm going to show you that you're going to have dependence on me because, of course, could they beat the Nephilim? No. Could they tear down the fortified cities? Not at all. They were not warriors. Are you kidding me? And just to make it even better, if you'll go to Joshua, when they crossed the water, when they got over, the first thing Joshua did was God said, all right, I need you, Moses is gone. I need you to give a message to the people. So I'm, young new pastor. Joshua's like, okay, what message, God, do you want to preach? He says, all right, you got the water behind you, so the only way forward is the enemy. I need you to go tell all the men that they have to be circumcised. Is there another sermon? Because Moses had some good ones. I don't know. And the first thing that God had Caleb do, or Joshua do, was wound the people. You ain't fighting after that happens with a flint knife, a.k.a. sharp rock. God had to wound them. He is trying so hard to get them to trust. Have you ever had a moment in your life where God allowed you to go through some pain in order for you to become dependent on him? You've gone through some stuff. Have you've been there? You maybe ask, well, why am I still suffering? Why am I still dealing with this? Because sometimes God will let you go through those things because here's what he is doing. And if you feel like I feel like he keeps telling me the same lesson over and over again, it's because you hadn't learned it. So he's going to keep teaching you. And what he is doing is not trying to punish you. He's allowing you to go through it. And you'll be able to go through it a whole lot better when your dependency becomes on him and trust him. That he's got this. That he's got it. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and chapter 12. 2 Corinthians 11, Paul's sharing about his hardship in ministry. Listen to this. This is a resume I do not want, by the way. He says, are they servants of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I'm a better one, with far more labors, many more imprisonments, far worse beatings, many times near death. You don't hire this pastor, right? He's a convict. And he says, 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1 from the Jews. From the Jewish people. Not, you would think that would be from the Romans. This was from the church people. 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1 from the Jews. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I have spent a night and a day in the open sea. On all these journeys, I faced dangers from rivers and dangers from robbers and dangers from my own people. Dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, dangers among false brothers. There was toil, there was hardships, there was many sleepless nights. It was hungry, I was thirsty, often without food, I was cold, I was without clothing, and not to mention all the other things. This is the daily pressure on me and my concern for all of the churches. Like, man, how is Paul still alive? This was a lot. And to make things worse, and you get the end of the book of Acts, Paul gets on a boat because he's finally going to take the gospel to Rome. That's all he's wanted to do is get the gospel to Rome. And the opportunity finally comes. He didn't realize, though, to get to Rome, he was going to be going to Rome in handcuffs. So he gets on a boat, and he's celebrating. I get to go preach the gospel in Rome. We're going to Rome. Let's go to Rome. Shipwreck. Paul jumps off the ship, and everything's like, oh, God, I thought we were going to Rome, man. What happened? And then he comes on an island called Malta. It's cold. Paul's like, Well, I'm a traveler. I'm a hiker. Let's make a fire. And so everything seems okay. He's got what he needs. Until he grabs a piece of wood and the snake bites him. He's like, are you serious right now? Like, I've got a snake bite. And God heals him. And God will use Paul on the island of Malta to change the lives of the people before he gets on the next boat a few months later to finally get to Rome in chains. He uses the circumstances. By the way, that's the same verse that people use that we should take up the serpent and celebrate because Paul didn't die from the poisonous snake. That's not what that verse means. Do not bring you snakes. That's Paul's life, though. But then, that sounds awful, right? Anybody want to live that life that Paul had? Anybody signing up for that? But watch this. He talks about how God has brought him in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He talks about how God has brought him to this third heaven to see. Look in verse 7 of chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians. He says this, therefore, so that I would not exalt myself, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan given to torment me so that I would not exalt myself. We don't know what that thorn is, okay? Concerning this, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it would leave me. Please take this from me. But he said, listen, God, take this away from me. And you would want God to say, okay, I got it. Let me take it. He asked him how many times? 3 times. Please, God, take this away. Take it away. Whatever it was tormenting. It was from Satan. It was not good. And he recognized that what was happening was keeping him from boasting. So he would expect God to say, I'll take it away from you, bro. I forgot everything that happened in chapter 11. Let me work this out for you in a better ending. Look what God says. He doesn't say, I'm going to make this better. God says this. He doesn't say, I'm going to take it away. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, and my power is perfected in weakness. That's not the answer I was looking for. And he says, therefore, I will most gladly boast all the more, not about my strengths and all things that I do good. I will boast more about my weakness so that Christ's power may reside in me. So I take pleasure in weakness. I take pleasure in insults. I take pleasure in hardships. I take pleasure in persecutions. And I take pleasure in the difficulties for the sake of Jesus. For when I am weak, Paul says, I am strong. You ever prayed and asked God to take something away and he didn't do it? And instead of realizing that his grace was all that you needed, it was sufficient, it was everything that you needed, that we found ourselves complaining that God just would not take it away, but yet the thing that he allowed to happen is the very thing he was using to draw us to him. If people have sold you Christianity in these rainbows and butterfly language, that's not it. It's hard. Is it not? It's hard dealing with people sometimes. And sometimes it's hard dealing with church people. Those are the ones that you just want to lay hands on in a different way, right? In the Berkeley County translation, not the Hebrew translation. But this is exactly what's happening to the life of all these Israelites. God's taking them through some hardships. He's bringing them from a place of surrender. I need you to surrender. I want you to experience humility, and I want you to experience dependency upon me. I've provided every step of the way out of Egypt. I heard your cries in Egypt. I sent someone to bring you out of that place, to take you in. And we know, and he says this in Exodus all the time, that it was God bringing them from and leading them to. But here's the problem. They were not ready for what was in the in-between. The in-between was the fertile ground to surrender, to experience humility, to experience the dependency upon him. But there's a man in the group that God is concerned about, and his name is Joshua. Here's what's interesting. Joshua's going to lead the future generations in the promised land. He's going to be the one to take the mantle from Moses, and he's going to go forward. And it's no accident, by the way, that his name is Joshua. Because in the Hebrew language, the name Joshua means Yeshua. Does that name sound familiar? That name sounds very familiar. In the Hebrew language, the name Joshua is Yeshua, and the other man in the New Testament who has the name Yeshua is the man named Jesus. Joshua is a Jesus-like figure. Remember, the Old Testament points to the coming of the New Testament. Because what does Jesus do? Jesus leads us out of our wildernesses. Jesus leads us out of our pain, and he leads us into the promised land. into the life that is life more abundant. Wouldn't you agree with me that the promised land was a life that was way more abundant than what was in Egypt? So God's saying to Joshua, listen, man, I love you. You're the next guy. You're going to bring the people to the promised land, but you're going to suffer with them. No thanks. I'm good. And he says, you're going to suffer with them, and you're going to suffer with them for 40 years. Why 40 years? Because God's going to let them wander around in the wilderness 1 year for every day that they were gone as spies. There's your connection. You went 40 days and you came back with this negative report. I'm going to let you think 1 year on every day of what you just did. And the whole community. Listen to me. Have you ever thought that maybe your present suffering might be a gift that God is using to prepare you for something? You ever thought about that? Have you, maybe it's an illness, it's a financial downfall, maybe it's, let me just say, aren't you glad your final chapter's not written yet? Because if we had to end the story right here for some of us, you'd be like, this is a bad ending. But God has not written the final chapter. We go through suffering. So this negative report leads to a revolt. And let me tell you what the result is. Because for the Israelites, the result was not good. They're going to have to suffer for 40 years. This journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, about 7 days. But they did dumb things. It took 40 years. You ever been on those road trips where you keep passing the same thing every time? And you're like, I'm pretty sure we've passed that building like 10 minutes ago. Right? Y'all ever been lost like that? Not the women. I'm talking about the husbands. Y'all been there? Like, we don't need GPS. We don't need Apple Maps. We don't need Google Maps. We got this, right? And then at some point, after about an hour of us being lost, we decide just to stop, just to make sure that the map is correct, just to get where we need to be. There's a result. Look at verse 26 in Numbers 14. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. By the way, when people start teaming up on you, the first thing you need to do is go to Jesus and start listening to him and get his voice, because there's all these naysayers. Because what should have happened in a normal day is Moses would have been, you know what, you're right, I don't want to do this anymore. Let's just go back to Egypt. Y'all can all die. I don't care. Because I was fine in the desert, man. I had shepherds, I had a wife, I had a father-in-law, I had some sheep, and this burning bush, right? I was good. So y'all can go back where you came from. No, that's not what happens. They go to God. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. He says, how long must I endure this? What's the link? God's speaking. How long must I endure what kind of community? An evil community that keeps complaining about me. This is God speaking. And I have heard the Israelites' complaints that they're making against me. Tell them, as I live, this is the Lord's declaration. I will do exactly as I heard you say. Your corpses, this is not what you want to hear, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. All of you who were registered in the census, the entire number of you 20 years old or more will die here in this wilderness. Like, oh, that's not, this is probably a hard message to deliver to the people. You're not going to make it. We're on the way to Promised Land, but your generation ain't going to make it. If you're 20 years old or more, you're not going to make it, because he says, because you complained about me. I swear that none of you will enter the land that I promised to settle you in, except Caleb and Joshua. And I will bring your children whom you said would become plundered, I will bring them into the land that you reject. Your children are going to experience what you didn't experience. And they'll enjoy it. But as for you, your corpses are going to fall in the wilderness. Your children will be shepherds in the wilderness for 40 years. They'll bear the penalty of your acts of unfaithfulness. Say, nothing's changed, because as parents, if we don't lead our children the way, we also will suffer the same thing. And you will bear the consequences of your iniquities for 40 years based on the number of the 40 days that you scouted the land, a year for each day. You will know my displeasure. I want to know a lot of things about God. I do not want to know his displeasure personally. And this is what they're experiencing. These are God's people. So what God's showing us is there's a connection between Jesus' perspective of his generation and the perspective of the generation here, right? In 2 places in the New Testament, Jesus refers to the community around him as a wicked generation. Wicked generation. In Moses' day, the people wanted a sign of assurance. If we're supposed to go there, God give us a sign, shooting star, something, that they could take the land. And God said, you have faith, and you have my word. And I have given you my word. But you have to believe it. You don't need a sign. You just need to believe what I said. Have y'all ever prayed, just said, God, if this is what you want me to do, show me a sign? Let's be honest. I've asked for more shooting stars in my entire life, right? And in Jesus' day, he said, how long will I be with this evil generation? That they seek signs. And what they're going to get is the sign of Jonah. That's what he says. What was the sign of Jonah? That was destruction. And the people Jesus came to save rejected him, and the people God called to serve him rebelled against him. So this makes me ask the question, how in the world could they doubt God? How could the Israelites doubt God? He gave them manna. He saved and spared their sons, the Passover. The Egyptians were about to kill them, and God parted the water so that they could walk to the other side. They went through a drought and needed something to drink. God provides water for them. He freed them from slavery. How in the world could they doubt? But here, I guess this is probably a bigger question. How in the world can we doubt? Because I want to cast judgment so hard on the Israelites, but I find myself as an Israelite. We are people of the book. How do we doubt? We believe, and then we don't believe. We believe God can save us, but we maybe don't believe that God can save some of our family members. Maybe we don't believe that God can save some of the people we come in contact out in the open marketplace. He can save me, right? We have doubts. By the way, if you have doubts, the best place for you to bring those doubts is right here. Jesus is not offended by your doubts. It's in the doubts that we experience the tension. It's the tension. So here's the point of this whole passage. We would sum it up this way, is walk by faith and not by fear. Walk by faith and not by fear. What we see here is something very insightful for this man named Caleb, who had to speak out and be a louder voice among the other voices of negativity. And Caleb, he says something that is an amazing connection for us today. He says something in Numbers 14:9. He shows us that the fear of man, if we fear man, it is a rebellion against God. And he says this in Numbers 14:9, only don't rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, for we will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them. Man, he's speaking some truths. And the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. How does Caleb make this statement? He stepped into the same land as the other spies. He ate the same fruit as the other spies. He saw the same fortified cities as the other spies. Yet he came to a completely different understanding of what could happen. Here's why. He did not let the facts overshadow his faith. He didn't. Don't let the facts overshadow faith. If God says it, you better believe it. The Bible says that the promises of God are always yes and amen. There are no expiration dates to God's promises. They will happen. If He says it, it's going to happen. And sometimes the prayers and the things that you ask in this generation, He may not answer in this generation. It may be in the next generation with the next person. But if He promises it, it will happen. The question is, how do we know what we're fearful of? I think the best question to ask with that is, what life rafts are you clinging to? That if that life raft sank, you would feel hopeless. And whatever that is, it might be a job, it might be your family, it might be a hobby, it might be a friendship. That's where your dependency is. Because if your life raft is not Jesus, we're in trouble. You're in trouble. The way we conquer fear is to exercise faith in God's promises. To exercise faith in the promises. When we exercise faith, we overcome fear. I found myself in the last days reminding myself of God's promises. That He is faithful. That He is in the midst, that He is with us. If we seek Him, we will find Him. These are promises. That things don't happen by accident. God is involved. God is in the, I'm just reminding myself, it's overcoming fears. One of the things that I've learned this week about my dad, as a kid, he didn't share a whole lot about things, but I realized he lived a life of faith. And my dad, for years, was an emergency medical technician, became a paramedic, worked in the medical field. That when I was coming through, I decided I want to be like that, and I went to EMT school. But about 1993, my dad gives his life to Christ in our living room, and I see him praying. Like, not many times do you get to see your parents physically praying, asking Jesus to save them, especially in the living room. And I remember that moment. And it came, by the way, because two guys from the church that we had just visited dropped by to visit just to say hi and wanted to welcome us to the church. And they led my family to Christ. And my dad got a call on his life to be a pastor. And a really different pastor, because he was called to go lead a camp, a Baptist retreat center. Let me just tell you the experience that he had. None. He volunteered in the youth group. And that was tough, because I was in the youth group. Right? And he interviewed and he took this job, and we moved from Dillon, South Carolina, a.k.a. heaven, and we moved to Bennettsville, South Carolina. Now, if you don't know about Bennettsville, it's tobacco fields, a federal prison, and a state prison, and a Baptist camp. And my dad called the guy that was mentoring, discipling him, and said, I'm going to let my paramedic license lapse. He says, you don't want to do that? He said, yes, I do. I want nothing to fall back on. And after that first year, I didn't know the cries and the tears. Like, we went to this camp. They didn't have a house here. We living in a little cabin. You talk about wanting to kill each other. And then here's what happens. 29 years later, he dies there. For 29 years, God used him. We calculate over 20,000 people were ministered to in his lifetime because he didn't want any fallback. That it's all or nothing. All the things on paper show I'm not qualified. But I'm going to trust God in this. I think about that often, about how unqualified we all are. But Jesus uses us despite the facts, because he's called us to live out life and trusting him. You know what fear is? Fear is false evidence appearing real. That's all it is. 10 of the spies in the store were in fear of something that was never going to happen. They're going to kill us. No, they're not. God said it wasn't. They were in fear of what they thought was going to happen. You cannot fear man and God at the same time. Fear and faith cannot coexist. You can't have both. It's one or the other. You either live in fear or you live in faith. So when you fear God, you're fearless. You're fearless because you know, I know this doesn't look right on paper. I know what the situation, the circumstances surrounding me, but I also know what God's asked me to do. And I'm going to walk through the uncertainty, because the one thing I am certain of in the uncertainty is the certainty of God's presence to meet me in that place that he has called me to. And if we would have that kind of faith, what would it look like in our homes and in our churches and in our marketplaces? That we just boldly walk where God said, well, I don't have enough money to do this. I remember when we started this church, I said, how much is it going to cost to start a church? Because I always thought like $120,000. And they're like, no, it costs $45,000. That's great. How much do you guys have? We have zero in the bank account. Matter of fact, we don't even have a bank account. They won't give us one until we get money. And I was on the phone with one of our overseers, and he said, there's always money in the fish's mouth. If God's called you to it, he's gonna provide. If it's God's will, it's God's bill, basically. Probably not really good theology, but just, he says, you just pray and ask God. But it's $45,000 what it would take to start a church. Okay. That was a lot better than $120,000. I'll never forget going to the mailbox that day. We had a post office box. We were able to pay for a post office box, which I need to cancel because we have mailbox. And I opened it, and there was a white envelope in there from a name I didn't recognize. And there was a check for $45,000. from someone that doesn't even attend this church and said, just heard what you were doing. We believe in you. We believe in this. We want to give. I shut the mailbox. I put the envelope back in the mailbox. Shut it. Did it again just to make sure. Made 2 phone calls. Made one to my wife and told her, you'll never believe this. I'm going to be late. I was supposed to meet her somewhere. I'm going to be late. I need to get this to the bank just in case. And then the second phone call was to Brandon Cleary and told him, you'll never believe what happened. He said, why would I be surprised? Well, I needed his faith. You got to believe. If God tells you he's going to do it, he's going to provide, no matter what it looks like. He's going to provide. Has he not done that in this church for us as a body? How bad do we want a building? We want one bad. But we said it's in God's timing. And then we don't get a random phone call. We get a divine phone call. So we've decided to shut the church down. We want to see if you guys are interested. And here we are. Because God provides. And you have stories like that in your own personal life of how God's provided. Despite what it looked like. I was told this would never work. I want to make phone calls. I'm like, guess what? It's working. You can't do church that way. Okay. They did it in Acts chapter 2. I've learned that you never doubt in the darkness what God has revealed to you in the light. I just have to remember his promises. What are you fearful of? What do you feel paralyzed by today? You're not defined by your past. God is still writing your story. If you don't hear anything else from me today, God, number 1, is still active writing your story. He's not finished with you. And if you're a believer in here today, you're a child of the King, and you need to stop letting naysayers dictate your life and defining who you are and defining everything about you, and listen to God and let him define you. He has called you his son and his daughter. That is huge. If God is for us, who can be against us? One of the greatest tragedies in this passage is this. We would rather go back to Egypt. The people would rather endure the pain they know than step into the pain of the unknown. And the decision had consequences in their children's lives for years to come because they just wouldn't simply walk out on faith. Here's where we are this morning as we close. What are you fearful of this morning that you need to surrender to Jesus? Because if you're fearing it, it's not in the right hands. And you need to hand it over. So we're going to sing. And as we do so, I want you to go into a place of just praying right where you are. Maybe you need to ask somebody beside you, I just need you to pray for me. Maybe you need to go back to the cross and have someone pray for you there. But what is paralyzing you with fear? Because you know God is calling you. You know, God, that he is nudging you. I don't know what that is that he's nudging you. Maybe it's to spend more time with him. Maybe it's to be praying more. Maybe it's a conversation that you need to have. Maybe it's reconciling a relationship with someone. I don't know what it is, but there's a fear that's blocking God's plan from happening. And you need to surrender that fear to him and trust him. But you need to verbally confess that to him. There's a blockage. And here's my promise, because I'm just telling you from experience. When we confess, the blessings flow. And I'm not talking about like riches. I'm talking about knowing that everything is good. So I want to challenge you. Let this be a moment of surrender and humility right now. Father, I thank you so much for who you are. I thank you for your words in the scripture. I thank you that this room would be full of Joshua and Caleb's surrendering. God, you tell Joshua that every place that he'll step foot, you have already given him. We stand on holy ground today. We stand on holy ground in this church. We stand on holy ground in our workplaces. We step on holy ground even when we go to Walmart, Lord. It is holy ground because you were there. Let us not fear. We have no fear of man. We trust you, God, who created everything just through his words. Your words, God, you spoke it into being, including us. We all were once just vocal cords. wavelengths in your vocal cords. You speak us into existence. May now we surrender to you as you want us to draw close to you, to have dependency on you and you alone. I pray these things in your name.